Okay, I just got out of a wedding and I've got to drive back here, and I have a speculative train of thought here, and I'm going to preface it that it's speculative. Someone asked on my wall, what do you mean in that last message when you said, of his increase of his kingdom, there shall be no end? And I was talking about how forever and ever God is going to have new wonders to show us, and the ages to come he's going to show forth the exceeding riches of his grace and kindness towards us, right? So I started thinking about that, and he said, do you mean that there will be children, and we'll just keep having children, and that will be the increase, more people? Because when you think of a kingdom, you think of its constituents. And he could support that from Isaiah, where it talks about the millennium. We know during the millennium, the mortals who survive the tribulation and are saved will go in to populate the millennial kingdom, and they will have children. It says that 100 years old, they'll be considered a child. So they'll be back to living somewhat like pre-flood conditions, but even better because the curse will be rolled back as well. So yeah, I see that, but then I said, well, I think it's bigger than that, because what about after the new heavens and the new earth, when everybody's resurrected? And I thought about, what is the increase of his kingdom? I believe God's purpose is revealed in Ephesians, and especially in chapter 3, where it is the multifarious wisdom of God put on display to the principalities and the powers through the church. It says that's his eternal purpose. And this has to do with his economy, which is his dispensing of himself into his chosen people to constitute them with himself and to build them up to be his expression. Well, what is it that God is putting on display of himself in the church for the angels that the angels couldn't have already seen? They see God face to face. Well, what do they see? They see his power and his throne and his majesty and his glory, right? And the fact that he dwells in inapproachable light. And that is actually something we don't see. And I did a video about how we are blindfolded. The angels are fascinated with our salvation because we are brought into a more intimate knowledge of God than they are, even though we're blindfolded. By faith, we're brought into God's heart through the Spirit. We're brought closer to God than they'll ever be. We are one with God, and he dwells in us. We've become the Holy of Holies. That is deeper and more profound than what they have. They have an outward relationship with God the way you would have an outward relationship with a king. Okay? And it's glorious and it's wonderful. I don't want to take away from that, but what we have is something different. Faith is something new. Walking by faith and not by sight is something that's probably a mystery to them. But what else is put on display in God's procedure to produce the church? What did he do to produce the church? Well, he incarnated himself and became a man, and that man fully expressed the Godhead. The fullness of the Godhead dwelt in him, and yet he chose to put off the independent attribute of his divinity, the independent use of the attribute of his divinity. That's a new phrase that somebody gave me. And took on the form of a servant. Well, that is condescension. They knew God as the glorious and mighty one. It literally was something that they couldn't have even possibly fathomed, to say that he would condescend to become incarnated in the creation as a little man who had humble beginnings, was a babe, was fleeing from Herod, all that stuff, and then even humbled himself further to the suffering of the death and enduring the scoffing and mocking and humiliation and beating and spitting and crucifixion, that's not even something that he could have used words to describe to them. They wouldn't have understood at all. He, through that, put a whole set of attributes on display that they had never even conceived of before and probably didn't even have language for. His compassion, his mercy, his tenderness, his approachability, his goodness, his sweetness, his affection. Think about John leaning his head on Jesus' breast. Think about an angel who's seen the glory of God and has approached the throne for ages with fear and trembling before this glorious throne, around which the cherubim are saying, they're flying around continually saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty," that you can't even approach it. And yet, this clay man, John, is able to lay his shoulder on Jesus' breast and know that he's the one that Jesus loves. And the angels know this person is the Son of God. This is the one that was on the throne. This is the Ancient of Days, the one we saw in glory. These guys have no idea who he is. They don't know how to worship him the way we do. And yet there's an intimacy and a tenderness and a friendship and an affection there that we can't even understand. We don't even know what those emotions are. And, his compassion for the sick and his mercy. And then in the cross, he became sin and he tasted death for us. And now as our high priest, he has a sympathetic nature that literally has tasted all of our sorrow and suffering and abandonment and disillusionment and brokenness and all of our anger and wrath and hatred and everything that's in us. He wore that on the cross, somehow experientially, so that today he's touched, it says, with a present feeling. That's the Greek. It's a touch with the feeling of our infirmities. Doesn't mean I'm just sympathetic with you. It's that he actually feels it as we do, and it automatically elicits a groaning from the spirit of intercession, which is connected to his high priestly ministry, so that he responds to it with his life. That is an organic union where his life responds sympathetically to our weakness and our need as if it's his own. And that's something we can barely grasp. What about the angels? No wonder angels inquire into the salvation. That's what Peter says. And also, Paul mentions that communion and the head coverings and all the stuff there was for the angels, because the angels are watching the church and learning things about headship and submission and love and marriage and all these things as a picture of Christ in the church, where he's trying to show them who the bride is through the way we're supposed to take communion, which nobody does really anymore anyway, but it's because we don't really understand the depth of what's going on there. Paul says it's for the angels who are looking on. So the angels, God's eternal purpose is to put the multifarious wisdom of God, put himself, Christ, on display through the church to the principalities and powers. That's what it says in Ephesians. There's all these attributes of God that couldn't even be named, much less described, until God incarnated himself and went through the process, becoming a man, dying on the cross, raising from the dead, ascending to heaven, giving the Spirit, and identifying himself with us in so many new facets of his being put on display. His mercy, his compassion, his kindness, put on display in people who walk not by sight, but by faith, who are blindfolded, who have never seen his glory, and yet love him and rejoice in him with joy unspeakable, full of glory. That, for the angels, must be a mystery. Now, when you say, so that would be an increase of the kingdom. where there's a whole facet of God's being that previously had been unknown, undescribable, unconceivable, now on display in this universe. Well, there's going to be a new heavens and a new earth. Don't you think that there are probably new aspects of God that we don't have language for, that he would like to put on display in the next age? Ephesians says that the riches of his grace are going to be put on display in kindness towards us for the ages to come, age upon age. And how do we know that in the new heavens and the new earth there won't be a new created group of people? Not that Christ will die for them and all that stuff again. That's done. Now, this is totally speculative. But what if there's other people that need to know that God's going to show himself to in a new way? Or there's just new things. See, God's supply of attributes are inexhaustible. We know him as light, love, righteousness, holiness, compassion, mercy, tenderheartedness, the God of peace. We know all these things based on our language and our experience and what the Bible describes. But is that the end of the story? I don't think so. I think that, the holy, 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 the angels, they go around him, and every time they go around him, I've heard they see something new, Well, what if that's literally true? What if God is facing this way, and then for our sake, after the angels, he faced this way for the angels. Then for our sake, he faced this way, and they saw a whole new side of him. And then in the next age, he turns another way, and we all see a whole new side of him. And each time he turns, there's a whole new set of attributes that we can't even fathom. I think that may be what the increase of his kingdom, there shall be no end. I think that God is inexhaustible in what he is, and that he's going to put himself on display forever. And it's going to be a continual pouring forth of new things to discover in God forever and ever and ever. That's what I think. This is just my science fiction mind trying to get my mind around what it is that God's doing, And on a side note, and this is kind of silly, but this is my imagination, the way it works. I was in the airport in San Francisco in the bathroom, and while I was in the bathroom, I suddenly had the thought, of course there will be airports in the millennium. And I was like, what? What is that? And then I thought about how everyone's required in the millennium to go up to the feasts. And I thought, they're going to be mortals. Of course they're going to need to travel. They're not going to be able to just blink and get there the way the resurrected king priests are. They're going to need means of transportation, and there's going to be technology, and there's going to be cities, and there's going to be a whole rebuilding thing where there will be a technological society. It may be more agrarian, I don't know, but I believe that they'll need modes of travel and communication and stuff like that. And all of a sudden I saw myself there, and and this isn't a vision per se, but I did feel satisfied by it, and it may have been something from God. I imagined myself befriending a mortal. I was a resurrected king priest, right? And I was going around, and I made friends with a mortal. And I imagined myself appearing to him throughout his life as he grew old, at different times, talking to him and enjoying his company or whatever. And then it was time for him to pass away. He was a believer, and I was there with him as he transitioned to death, as a comfort to him and as a minister. Now that was all happened in about 30 seconds, but it was just an aha moment of, I felt like I was looking right into maybe one of my roles in the kingdom. I don't know. I just feel like we're getting so close. We think so much like our life is here, and then there's the next life. But in God's mind, it's all one life. And in the blink of an eye, whether it's through death or rapture, we're going to be into the next phase, picking up with God where we left off in a way, So I just thought that was interesting. All this is edifying to me. But yeah, that's what I kind of think that of the kingdom's increase, there should be no end. I think that's what it might mean. I believe it's all focused on Christ being put on display forever, new facets of his being, but it's in his people, so we're part of it, and we will see what that looks like. Take care.